Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening if you are joining us from the West Coast or across the Atlantic or here in New York. The Fordham bells tell me it's 1 o'clock. I am Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwittel Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham and the co-director of the Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our third event in a four-part series titled How Did We Get Here? A deep dive into the history of Israel and Palestine with Hussein, Ibish, and David and Mayers. Today's session will focus on the period from 1967 to 2023. This series is co-presented jointly by Fordham Center for Jewish Studies, Center on Religion and Culture, the Department of History, the International Studies Program, and the Middle Eastern Studies Program. And we're very grateful to all the partners. There is perhaps no conflict more complex, fraught, and resistant to solutions than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The conflict has shown, as we've seen in the last few months, a unique capacity to pull us in emotionally or pull us apart emotionally, to mobilize globally and to make so many individuals and communities, even those far from the war, feel vulnerable and afraid. This series, presented in the aftermath of October 7th, seeks to provide our community with learning opportunities that can help us understand not only the long history of the conflict, but also how specific historical events are understood, often differently, clashingly, by those involved in this conflict. And yet, although we tend to think about this conflict as involving only two sides, even the principal side, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, are not monolithic. And as the last two parts in recent months have shown to us, there is a larger regional and global context that only makes this conflict more difficult to resolve and to process. We have received a lot of feedback from you, both in appreciation and critique, and we thank you for that. We value your engagement and desire to know and hear more. We appreciate, what we appreciate most is that while many here or some here may, for different reasons, feel emotionally closer to one or the other side of the principal groups affected by this protracted and violent conflict, and may want this side's perspective, pain, and experience to be heard and seen, we have all come here to try to hear and see the other side's perspective as well. This can sometimes be uncomfortable, painful, and frustrating, and there's no comfort in this conflict. But it is needed for us to listen, to learn. It is in fact necessary. So we thank you all for being here. The series provides an outline of the history, rushing, we realize, through many decades and events, each deserving its own time. The series seeks to present the events without trying to score political points, though this topic is never devoid of politics, no matter how it is approached. And there is, of course, more than could be explored. After all, there's more to conflicts than facts and politics, which can only tell part of the story. There's also art, film, and literature that are perhaps better able to convey feelings, pain, resilience, and to showcase even the unrepresented voices not seen in a political process. And we hope in the future we'll have an opportunity to do that as well. Fordham, as a Jesuit university, as we've seen in the past, is very well positioned to engage in a thoughtful and considerate discussions on these most difficult topics. The idea of cura personalis, the caring for the whole person, can help us perhaps see each other at the time of entrenchment and divide, and help us search for, as Pope Francis recently urged to universities, for concord in place of indifference, polarization, and conflict. As we continue to feel anguished and anxious, overwhelmed and hopeless, and as we continue to grieve, pray, and mourn, we also try to learn. So I am very grateful to our partners for co-sponsoring this program, to our students and faculty whose curiosity and interest and commitment to learning have motivated this program. And many thanks to all of you who are joining us today and have joined us in the past and will join us hopefully on our last event in March, Part 4. And of course, special thanks to our two speakers, Hussein, Ibish, and David and Mayers, for their willingness to engage with us at length and in depth. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. He is a weekly columnist for The National and has previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine. David N. Myers is distinguished professor and Sadie Ludwig Kahn Chair of Jewish History at UCLA, where he also directs the UCLA Laskin Center for History and Policy and the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. David Myers is a distinguished scholar of modern Jewish history, including the history of Zionism, and is the author and editor of many books, including relevant here, The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life. Please post your questions and comments in the Q&A section of the screen. We will try to get to as many as we can, and we will forward the questions and comments to our speakers after the event as well. And again, please mark your calendars. Tuesday, March 19th at 6 p.m. in person and live stream will be the last part of this series, focusing on October 7th and its aftermath. So David and Hussein, we're very honored to have you with us back at Fordham, and the screen is yours.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation to deliver this series of talks, particularly at this moment in time, which we both think is so critically important. I just want to say that we very much welcome feedback and critique of what we have presented, and we'll try in the future to respond as fully as possible to questions that perhaps remain unanswered in the time that we have allotted today. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to actually jump right in. I'm just going to begin by reminding us where we're at in our sequence. This is the third of talks we've given. This will largely focus on that phase of the relationship or conflict that we've been charting over the course, or will be charting over the course of some 140 years. That stage of the conflict that directly focuses on Israelis and Palestinians. We'll begin by talking a bit about the end of that, the earlier period, which was a state-on-state conflict. And just a reminder that the final talk on March 19th will take up October 7th and its aftermath. So we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible as can make it. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Hussein.
Oh, thank you very much, David. Really appreciate it. So our chronology and our analysis of how the Israeli and Palestinian national narratives developed brings us to the 1967 war. After the 1973 war, excuse me, after the 1967 war, there was, as we said last time, elation in Israel and shock and really total discombobulation in the Arab world, which I think continues to resonate even to this day. And what that set up was a situation in which the Arab states, like Egypt in particular, but Syria and Jordan and others, could not bring themselves to negotiate with Israel. They couldn't make any compromises with Israel without feeling emasculated and without feeling totally humiliated. On the other hand, I think there were lots of Israelis who felt no need to compromise, even with large and powerful Arab neighbors like Egypt. And what happened was, I think that there's a good possibility, we can't prove this, but there's a very strong case to be made that Anwar Sadat wanted to make a deal before the 1973 war. He made many overtures to Israel. He was rebuffed at every stage. And what he ended up doing was orchestrating a surprise attack by Egypt and supported by Syria and eventually other states on Yom Kippur, the Jewish holiday in 1973, that went much better for the Arab side than any other war with Israel. The Egyptians broke through in the Sinai. They were proceeding up it towards Israel itself. There was a lot of panic in Israel. And it took the Israelis several days to right themselves and to gather American support and push back and end the war as a stalemate with a small Egyptian territorial gain in the region of the Suez Canal, but otherwise a return to the borders left by the 1967 war. But you had Egypt left with a sense of tremendous restoration of national pride, the ability, therefore, to negotiate with Israel without feeling totally humiliated and make concessions. You have in Israel reminded that things can always go badly and that it's not a case of being invulnerable and invincible, that it really would be a good idea to make a deal with these Arab countries, especially Egypt, which are large and powerful. And finally, you have the United States having maneuvered into a position where it was central to negotiations. And what that set up was the beginning of a realization that the two-state solution was necessary, and also, more importantly, to set up the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that followed.
Yeah, I'll just amplify that before moving on by saying that one thing that we're going to see emerge in the next few minutes is the formula of land for peace that emerged out of United Nations Resolution 242, Security Council 242 from 22 November 1967. And this is a principle that will become operationalized in the negotiations between Egypt and Israel and represent a formula for future negotiations. I just want to say one other point about 73, and it's an obvious one. Hussein alluded to it, which is that the attack by Egypt delivered a huge shock to the Israeli body politic and population. In retracing the steps from 1973 to 1977-78, we might say that, in fact, it jolted Israeli political thinkers out of the earlier conception that they had of existence in a state of eternal war.
There's a lot of evidence that Sadat knew that Israel needed a jolt and the Arabs needed a shot in the arm, and that otherwise he wasn't going to get anywhere.
And he himself had arrived at that conclusion that there was that there may be another way, and ironically, the way to it was
through war.
Was through war, was to restore a measure of dignity and honor and to deliver that jolt. In any event, a new conception did emerge in Israel, and it's represented in the negotiations that took place involving Egypt, Israel, and the United States. But the real thunderbolt that occurred was when President Anwar Sadat decided to go to Jerusalem in 1977, and in some sense, it was a counterintuitive moment because the prime minister of Israel at the time was Menachem Begin, the longtime opposition leader who sat in the opposition for 30 years and was brought to power in what is known as the Mahapach, the overturning of the prior political establishment represented by the Labor Party. Begin was of the right-wing revisionist branch of Zionism, a member of the Likud party, and thus would seem not the likeliest partner for Sadat's overtures. But in fact, Begin was, in some sense, the person who could deliver what he had to the Israeli public precisely because of his revisionist background. So Sadat comes to Jerusalem, and shortly thereafter, the United States becomes involved and convenes a negotiation process at Camp David based on the principle of land for peace. And that treaty is signed in 78, implemented in 79. And in that negotiation, Israel agrees to surrender the Sinai Peninsula, which it gained by conquest in 1967, in return for full diplomatic relations with Israel. And it's at this point that we reach really the end of the phase we had discussed last time, the phase in the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, the state-on-state based conflict. And it's also at this point that we begin the process of returning to the Palestinian question that was in some sense left behind in 1948. There were some attempts to offer very minimal resolutions to the Palestinian question in the Camp David process, mainly, as Begin advocated, in the form of local autonomy given to Palestinian towns and villages, with a 5-year timeline by which certain results were expected to be achieved. That didn't really amount to much. And in fact, the Palestinian question was in the negotiations at Camp David really secondary, if not tertiary. But now that the Israel-Egypt treaty is signed, the focus of attention will turn to the Palestinian question again.
In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the Arab states were kind of fighting to reverse 1948, fighting on behalf of Palestinians. In the 70s, they were fighting and then negotiating both in order to get their land back from Israel. In other words, the Palestinian issue, as David said, became secondary to their aims. And where they could succeed in getting their land back, they could not and did not try to succeed very much in pushing Palestinian rights. That really the next key inflection point is the first Lebanon War. Israel had invaded Lebanon several times before, most notably in 1978, but not in a major way and not for an extended period of time. However, Israel in 1982, under Defense Minister Ariel Sharon in particular, wanted to drive the PLO out of southern Lebanon and kind of crush the Palestinian national movement as it had reformed itself in Lebanon after Palestinian militants were driven out of Jordan in the Black September events of 1970. And what's remarkable is that the Israelis used the assassination of a diplomat by an Iraqi-backed dissident anti-PLO group among Palestinians, Abu Nial's group, backed by Iraq, as a rationalization for invading Lebanon. It began as an effort to create a cordon sanitaire up to the Litani River, which is about 29, 30 kilometers or 25 miles. It depends where you draw the Litani, frankly. But it's well inside Lebanon. And this is now, again, the focus of Israeli attention regarding Hezbollah. We can get to that next time. But the real objective was to rout the PLO from Beirut, to get rid of the Palestinian national movement in Lebanon. It was generally regarded as the first national war without a consensus in Israel and was seen in the West as a war of choice, whereas all the earlier wars, glossing over 1956, but the 48 war, the 67 war, even though it was started by Israel, and the 73 war were all seen as wars of necessity and as things that situations which Israel didn't have much of a choice. But here Israel was deciding to create a large war where it wasn't absolutely necessary by any means. The PLO was expelled from Lebanon's fighters and leaders, left with great fanfare to Tunis on ships. Israel agreed not to enter the city. Then the Lebanese president-elect Bashir Gemayel was assassinated by figures still debated and unknown. Israel used that as a pretext to break its word and enter Beirut. In the process, they surrounded and controlled the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, and the Lebanese forces and other Lebanese militia groups, Christian militia groups, seeking to avenge various massacres and atrocities and grudges from the Lebanese Civil War, entered the camps on the encouragement of Israel, and Palestinians not allowed to go in and out of the camps while by the Israeli forces, while a giant massacre took place, hundreds of unarmed civilians killed in September of 1982. This led to massive international outrage in the West and in Israel, and it, I think, changed for the first time, Israel appeared to be the Goliath rather than the David, and a regional bully.
Yeah, and I'll just say that concern that Israel had become Goliath and not David was internalized by many Israelis who, I remember I was in Jerusalem at the time that the news of Sabra and Shatila on Rosh Hashanah made its way into Israel, and there was a sense of shock. There was a lack of clarity about what happened, who was responsible. Turns out that Israel was not directly responsible, but had provided cover for the Phalange to go into Sabra and Shatila. What this produced a week after Sabra and Shatila was the biggest demonstration ever held in Israel, which you see represented in the top right. And that large assembly of people really embodied a principle that had been developing over time over the previous 5 years, as represented in the name of the group that took rise in 1978, Peace Now. And there was a growing realization on the part of the Israeli public that that there was a kind of militaristic instinct that had become deeply ingrained into the Israeli national way. And this large constituency of Israelis was pushing back against it, and in particular focusing attention on what might be a just and equitable solution to the conflict with the Palestinians. And with that, I'm going to move on. So there was an enormous amount of energy generated around the Lebanon war, but it did not yield significant progress in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian side. And as a result of that, Palestinian frustration at the continuity of the occupation grew and reached a point of culmination at the end of 1987 in what turned out to be a car accident, an accident involving an Israeli truck driver and a car driven by a Palestinian, in which 4 Palestinians were killed, that served as a kind of spark to ignite what had been dormant Palestinian national consciousness and resistance against the occupation. That became the beginning of what is known as the first Palestinian uprising, the first Intifada, which was an intifada, an uprising that was conducted through acts of civil disobedience and boycotts, as well as stone throwing. That was sort of the extent of the violence on the Palestinian side. In response, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin,
I think he was defense minister.
Defense minister, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Hussein. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin called on soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces to very famously break the bones of the stone throwers. Of course, we'll see a different Rabin in just a bit, but I'm going to hand things over to Hussein again.
Oh, thank you. The key thing about the first Intifada is that it began, the PLO, as I say, was displaced to Tunis. And it really had lost control of the momentum of the Palestinian national movement. It didn't have a big presence in the occupied territories at that time. And the first Intifada was initially organized and led by local committees of prominent people, doctors, lawyers, intellectuals, professors, people like that, who came together in groups of people who had organized these boycotts and protests, and even the stone throwing that took place. Now, over time, the PLO mobilized to try to gain control over the Intifada and exercise some authority on the ground. As a result, the number 2 man in the PLO Abu Jihad, was gunned down by an Israeli assassination team in his home in Tunis in front of his family. And that sort of was an effort to break the PLO's control or growing presence in the occupied territories as a consequence of the First Intifada, muscling out the local committees and beginning to reassert its authority. But at the same time as the PLO was trying to marginalize these local committees, the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza established Hamas as a political and paramilitary organization with the aim of eventually marginalizing the secular nationalists of the PLO and making the Palestinian national cause an Islamist one under the leadership of Hamas, a struggle that continues to this day. It has not been resolved. It's very much part of the October 7 question, and we'll come back to it. But that all begins in the crucible of the First Intifada in 1987. Back to you, David.
Right. So the First Intifada, as we will see, is an instance in which an act of aggression against Israel leads to change. As we saw in 1973, and arguably as we will see in the wake of the Second Intifada. What we know is that that Palestinians are beginning to think of multiple strategies to combat the occupation of what they understand to be their country. One is through the civil disobedience of the First Intifada. The other is through political and diplomatic channels. And it's significant to note that Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, declares in 1989 that the old charter of the Palestinian national movement from 1964 was, as he famously said in French, caduc, was null and void. And this is the opening of the door to the recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization of the State of Israel. With that push forward, Palestinian negotiators of the second tier begin to meet with Israeli negotiators, not at the top level of authority, in a series of back-channel negotiations in the Norwegian capital of Oslo in the early 1990s, 1992, 93. And those negotiations, which prior to this point in time had actually been considered illegal as a matter of Israeli law, were yielded a significant breakthrough, which many of us remember quite visually by the picture we see in the middle on the right, when President Bill Clinton brings together quite actually physically Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, who, as of 1992, had been elected prime minister. So the negotiations begin with Palestinians and Israelis, the two main parties themselves, and subsequently the United States entered as an additional mediator. The result of that stage of the negotiation process was the exchange of letters of mutual recognition, which very significantly contains within it what we might call an asymmetry, something that has been a recurring feature in various international understandings of the relationship between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. And by that I mean that the letter that the PLO sent to Israel recognized the right of the State of Israel, and the letter that Israel sent the PLO recognized the right of the PLO to serve as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, not the right to create an independent state and achieve self-determination. Whether or not Rabin was willing to go that far remains very much an open question. We'll talk about in just a minute, but that is not what was contained in the exchange of letters. Hussein,
it's worth pointing out two things. First, that the in addition to the seeds of this agreement and the seeds of the Palestinian divide between Fatah and Hamas, and division between the West Bank and Gaza we see today. The first Intifada began when the Cold War was still a thing, but by the time it ended, the Cold War was effectively over, leaving this sort of space for the United States to begin to operate and freeing the hands, really, in some ways, of the Palestinians and even the Israelis to move forward and change matters. The other thing is that the First Intifada changed the image, the way that Israel's image was changed in 1982 from David to Goliath. The Palestinian image was changed in 1987 by the First Intifada, by presenting an image of Palestinians other than a bunch of terrorists or a bunch of wretched refugees, which had been the two images before, but rather of proactive, engaged protesters, little literal Davids throwing stones, intellectuals doing a Gramscian uprising against occupation, all of that. And all of this, I think, laid the groundwork for the Oslo agreements to come together. As we say, there is this asymmetry which is a continuation of the asymmetry we discussed in the Balfour Declaration, and which continues to this day. So next slide, David.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple points to
go for
that. This is a point that's relevant to the beginning of our presentation up to where we are now in the presentation, and that is the paramount significance of geopolitical considerations, as Hussein just mentioned. So the sort of departure of the Soviet Union as a significant factor in international relations, and the emergence for at least a relatively brief spell of a unipolar world in which the United States is the main international power. And here in this negotiation playing a central role.
One of the reasons the Palestinians agreed to this asymmetrical deal is they expected the U.S. to act as an aggressive and assertive guarantor of what they thought was understood.
Right, which again relates to sort of the constant motif of disappointment on the Palestinian side. The United States is not the honest broker that they had hoped for. But I do just want to highlight again how important the First Intifada was as a source of pride and self-dignity for Palestinians, which was, it seems, the essential prerequisite to Arafat's overture. Achieving that measure of self-respect that the Intifada offered allowed for that new political and diplomatic opening. And yet, as the Oslo process moved on from that memorable handshake in the Rose Garden in 1993, September 1993, the path forward was a very tricky and tortuous one. Certain achievements of note were notched, including Israel's second treaty with a neighboring Arab state, its treaty with Jordan in 1994, which augured a new era of open ties with the Arab world. Shimon Peres, the foreign minister at the time, said we are on the brink of a new regional and world order. But there were also very worrisome signs, particularly in Israel, where the opposition to Rabin's path forward in negotiation, again, although he did not explicitly call for a Palestinian state, there was still very considerable resistance, especially from the religious Zionist movement in Israel that had been gaining prominence as a result of the ongoing growth and institutionalization of the settlement movement, that is to say, the movement that represented Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank and Gaza. This bespoke a really deep divide, a deep chasm in Israeli political and public life between supporters of the peace process and opponents. In 1995, matters got quite ugly with representations of Yitzhak Rabin in many public spaces as resembling Adolf Hitler, or wearing a keffiyeh and being a traitor to his people. And that state of incitement is the context in which political violence becomes acceptable. And in fact, on November 4th, 1995, as many of us know and still remember where we were that day, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a member of the far-right religious Zionist movement, Yigal Amir. For many, this represented a significant, perhaps the most significant end to the considerable momentum forward that had been generated in 1993 and 1994. It's really important to note that after Rabin's assassination, the culture of incitement continued and informed the race for prime minister that ensued. It was widely assumed that Rabin's partner, Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, would be elected prime minister. In the first polls after Rabin's assassination, he was way ahead. But his opponent, Benjamin Netanyahu, proved to be quite adept in playing the card of national resistance to a form of betrayal that Peres and Rabin represented. In what seemed a surprise, though, given Shimon Peres's prior track record as a candidate for electoral office, Netanyahu won in 1996, and this represented a new phase in the tumultuous years of the Oslo process. Hussein?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think from the point of view of the Palestinian national, well, we'll come to that in a minute, but let me just break down what the Oslo agreements, Oslo 1, 2, and Y River, that is agreements between 1993 and 1998, which was the last time there was an Israeli PLO deal of any substance, was the division of the occupied territories into 3 sections. Area A, which was 18% of the remaining part of the West Bank, excluding municipal Jerusalem, as defined by Israel, which they claimed was annexed in 1980. But the rest of it, 18%, is constituted by this sort of archipelago of self-ruled areas controlled by the PA. It's about 18% of the West Bank and all of Gaza. Then we have Area B, which is Palestinian civil administration, but Israeli security control, which is another 22%. And then the large majority of the West Bank, excluding municipal Jerusalem, was retained to full Israeli controls, about 60%, and includes all the Israeli settlement. And that situation has persisted to this day, the only real adjustment being the split between the West Bank and Gaza.
Yep. So let us perhaps now attend to this. Do you want to start?
Okay. Let me begin. From the Palestinian the Palestinian national narrative involves the idea that Palestinians had made one of the greatest compromises in human history by accepting to negotiate only about the occupied territories, which is 22% of mandatory Palestine of the country they regarded as legitimately theirs, or at least that they should negotiate over, that they simply renounced. By recognizing Israel in 1993, they effectively renounced their claims to 78% of what they regarded as their country, and at least something that should be negotiated over rather than simply ceded to somebody else, but that's what they did. The problems with Oslo from the Palestinian point of view, other than that's regarded as a legitimate sacrifice in order to attain independence and statehood and end the occupation, but it was an extremely painful one, and it doesn't register with a lot of people because there's a lack of understanding that the Palestinian narrative begins with the idea that Palestinians have an equal claim to anybody else, and probably a greater one, on the entirety of mandatory Palestine. So the problems with Oslo from the Palestinian narrative perspective is, first of all, that there was no agreed upon goal, that it was a framework for negotiations that ground to a halt. Instead of going forward, it was supposed to be a 5-year period in which Israel was meant to withdraw from all of the occupied territories except for Jerusalem, settlements, and military zones. Now, that's not a defined territory. That could be a lot of the occupied territories. But Palestinians were kind of shocked that the areas A, B, and C thing was just tinkered with slightly after 93 and not at all after 98, and that the process ground to a halt, that there was no commitment to a Palestinian state, that it simply, these two parties who had incredible asymmetry of power were left to negotiate what they could between themselves, and that meant it was never going to end up with anything like a viable agreement from a Palestinian point of view. And finally, that there was no enforcement mechanism. This is less a matter of national narratives, but a problem from the PLO's perspective. They wanted the United States or some other international body backed by the United States, remember this is the unipolar era, to enforce agreements. And this is really a matter for the Palestinians, because the Israelis can enforce what they understand as Palestinian obligations by cutting off Palestinian tax money, by doing something obnoxious in the West Bank. They have plenty of leverage over Palestinians. So they don't need this external enforcement mechanism. They can do it themselves. Palestinians need somebody else, a third party, and they didn't get one. And so Israel was completely entitled entitled to go ahead and do what it thought it needed to, whether it broke the letter or spirit of the agreements or not.
Yeah, and just to sort of wrap up Hussein's point, what one hears from the Palestinian side in assessing the demise of the Oslo process is that the process generated no tangible benefit materially or territorially that could be presented to the Palestinian people.
And sorry, go. Just let me amplify that one thing. Both the Palestinian religious right, that is Hamas and company, and the Palestinian nationalist left, people like Edward Said and many intellectuals, so said what really you end up with is the PA becoming a Vichy regime and serving as a gendarmerie for the occupation, making the occupation safe for Israel, and not doing anything for Palestinian independence.
Yeah. Whereas on the Israeli side, there was a perception that Israel had made very considerable concessions, including a willingness to part with a large portion of the West Bank, somewhere between 93 and 96%. And that generous offer was rejected. And this really relates to an eternal question that surrounds the late stages of the Oslo peace process in 2000, over who really was responsible for its collapse. There are those, particularly on the Israeli side, who say Yasser Arafat did not have the courage to accept this very generous offer from Israel. There are those on the Palestinian side and elsewhere who say Ehud Barak, it really as a matter of personal chemistry, was not able to treat Arafat as an equal. And that sense of disrespect really colored the negotiations. Other observers note that the United States, under President Bill Clinton, tried to play a very central role as sort of the negotiator and enforcer, but that the United States lacked preparation in understanding the motivations of both actors, and did not act or serve as a kind of mediator open to both perspectives, but tended to submit its recommendations first to the Israeli side before then sending it on to the Palestinian side.
Let me just add something before you move on to the next point, which is that also Palestinians remember that Arafat didn't want to go to Camp David and thought it was a bad idea, and only went on condition that he wouldn't be blamed if it failed. And it failed, and he was promptly blamed. And so they felt very betrayed by that. And that Bill Clinton had a very good proposal, which was the Clinton parameters, which he did not release until after the Oslo summit, the Camp David summit failed among great fanfare. that during the Camp David summit, he simply backed Ehud Barak's proposals, that the Israeli proposals were treated as American proposals. And the United States did not make its own proposals until after the collapse of the summit, which was a terrible miscalculation on the part of Clinton. So I think all three parties really did badly. The Palestinians didn't come with a plan of their own. The Americans had one, but didn't present it. And the Israeli plan was obviously never going to be acceptable to the Palestinians.
Well, I'll get to that in just a minute about why it might
Please.
not be acceptable. But
Yes.
What's important to know from the Israeli context or perspective is that if Palestinians said there's no tangible benefit, no cessation to settlement, no granting of a significant territory to us, Israelis would say there was no cessation of violence. In the mid-1990s, 95 and 96, did not only witness intra-Jewish violence, but very, very fierce Palestinian violence in the form of
especially from Hamas.
Suicide bombings, very, very gruesome form of terrorism perpetrated by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, amongst others, that left very deep scars on the Israeli psyche. In some sense, following the kind of ecstatic moment of September 1993, there was this crushing decline when the reality of Palestinian terrorism returned to Israel. And for many, this was a prelude to what they would see and say in the second Intifada that we're just about to talk about. But I want to just offer one last point, which is many experts, including people who were at Camp David, part of the Oslo peace process throughout the 1990s, have said that for all of the compelling issues and yawning gaps between Israeli and Palestinian sides, the one issue that really was not bridgeable, at least not in any of the formulae that emerged in the Oslo process, was over Jerusalem, and that Arafat simply couldn't and wouldn't be prepared to concede on Jerusalem, which, of course, will be a very important issue in any future negotiation.
Yeah, it's not, you're right. It's not just Arafat. I don't think it, I mean, to be fair to Palestine, I don't think it's personalizable to Arafat. I don't think any Palestinian leader can simply accede to Israeli sovereignty in the Holy Basin, over the holy places, and over much of East Jerusalem. It's the main sticking point on both sides.
Which is instructive. Yeah, it's instructive in reminding us that sometimes there are deeper structures to these problems and to negotiating processes, and not just personalities. There's a tendency to place all responsibility and the burden of failure upon individuals, when in fact there are deep structural issues that are very, very, very tricky and may not lend themselves to reconciliation or certainly easy reconciliation. Hussein?
Okay, so what we end up with then is the prelude to the Second Intifada, because the discontent coming out of the Camp David summit was so great, and the tensions were so great, because I think Israelis felt betrayed that they had made what they believed was, or were told to, no one really knows what was proposed exactly at Camp David. We have a rough sense of it, but you know, if you look at Israeli statements about it, they begin as sort of, we offered 90%, and then they go all the way to 100%. You know, people like Rabin Perez end up saying, we offered them 100% of the West Bank. It's simply not true. But nothing was in writing, and there are no maps. There are no archives with official documents of the various proposals. So it's a matter of contested memory. Even the Americans who were there don't agree, but Palestinians felt betrayed by Israelis. Israelis felt betrayed by Palestinians. Why won't the other side be reasonable, etc. And although negotiations kept going on, even up to January 2001, Ariel Sharon was elected in February 2002, which is roughly when the negotiations stopped. They stopped for the election, and he never started them again. What you ended up with was an explosion of violence, in the occupied territories that became quickly known as the Second Intifada. It began after a visit to this most explosive place in the region, the place we keep coming back to. We first mentioned it as an epicenter of violence in the 1920s, David. You told people about that in our first lecture. And here we go again. Ariel Sharon visits the Temple Mount. There is a Palestinian narrative that says, and that's what caused the Second Intifada. Not true. There's an Israeli narrative that says Arafat had it planned all along. No evidence of that and no reason to believe it. The Mitchell Report, which was an American Commission of Inquiry led by Senator George Mitchell, did a very thorough review of the way the violence unfolded. And it unfolded in the days after Sharon visited the Temple Mount Haram Sharif. And it began with Palestinian protests and stone throwing and a very heavy-handed response, as usual, from the Israeli border police that was deadly, left many Palestinians killed. And that then spread very quickly into widespread protests all over the occupied territories. It was branded first by Hamas, but also very much by Arafat, who did not want to be outbid on Islam by the Islamists in Hamas as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, because it began at the Haram al-Sharif and the home of Al-Aqsa. That, I think, was a very negative move in the direction of religious orientation to this conflict, especially from the Palestinian point of view. And in the first few months, which were the late fall months of, so November and December, really, of 2000, you end up with a very large number of Palestinians killed and very few Israelis killed. And partly in order to push back against Fatah, and partly in an effort to redress that and take advantage of that situation, Hamas began a wave of suicide bombings that really got going in late January and February of 2000, right around the time Sharon got elected, and around the time the negotiations finally broke down, even though they were making progress the whole time. The best negotiation they had had to that date was at Taba in December of 2000. So while this mayhem was going on, the negotiators were making actually progress. They never came close to it, Camp David.
Extending into January, let me just jump in and say, extending into January.
Extending into,
the last rows of the Oslo peace process occurred in December, January. 2000, 2001, just as Bill Clinton is preparing to leave office. He believed, given his infinite powers of charisma, that he could get it done on his last day. And in fact, the farthest reaching statements of principles ever achieved occurred at Taba. But meanwhile, there was an intifada exploding.
That's absolutely right. If the political circumstances had allowed the Taba talks to continue under the Clinton parameters generally accepted by both sides, if they had really taken root, could have had an end to the conflict. But instead, what was going on was the Israeli right stoking the flames in order to get Sharon in power and to pursue their own anti-agreement agenda, and Hamas doing its best to turn the conflict into a religious war and a war of radical violence and terrorism. And what you ended up with then also is Fatah creating its own suicide bombing squads and Tanzim group, which was designed, in other words, they were taking their own politically defensive measures not to be out-militarized and out-Islamized by Hamas. So the Hamas managed to push the whole thing to the religious right, where you even had, for a brief part of its history, the secular nationalist Fatah sounding like a quasi-Islamist group, which is the only time it did. I mean, when the Second Intifada died down, they went right back to secularism. But during those few years, especially in 2001, 2002, and part of 2003, Fatah started sounding almost like a quasi-Islamist group because of their desire not to be outbid by Hamas.
And that competition between Palestinian factions had devastating consequences on the Israeli public,
course.
both in terms of the physical damage. So the suicide bombings reached a scale that had never been reached prior to that time. 1,000 Israelis died between 2000 and 2005. Over 3,000 Palestinians died in that same period. This was an exceptionally bloody and violent period in the history of the conflict. And even alongside the loss of life was the loss of hope, particularly pronounced amongst the Israeli Jewish population,
But
which
as much on the Palestinian side.
yeah, well, you'll say that in just a minute. But what I want to mention is the really stark transformation in the mindset of Israelis. There were cautionary notes already in the mid-1990s with the wave of suicide bombing then, but after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, we have many Israelis, including those who had been fervent supporters of the Oslo process, say, we now see the true intention of our enemies. It is jihadist, it is genocidal. There is no partner for peace, which is a recurrent line in the history of Israeli political life. And there was a sense that an era in the history of the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians had come to an end. That is to say, a golden era, a golden age, and that what now was likely to ensue was the return to eternal conflict, because this was an enemy with whom one could not speak.
I think Palestinians underwent a similar radicalization, although they did not really romanticize the Oslo years. I think they were very disappointed by it, but they were also shocked by the brutality of the Second Intifada, and they were radicalized in a similar way towards their own right wing, which is the religious right of Hamas. And it is during the Second Intifada that Hamas finally emerges from the distinct margins, from the non-competitive margins, to being a serious contender with Fatah for national leadership of the Palestinian national movement, which would shortly after the Second Intifada died down in February 2005, it didn't take long at all for that to manifest itself between Palestinian groups. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry, you first.
What do we say? Oh, yeah. So what were the consequences of the Intifada? One very important consequence is that Ehud Barak, who had been elected prime minister in 1999 and was engaged in what had been the most detailed negotiations, the most intense negotiations, the one on which the most hope had hinged, is voted out of office. And in his place comes Ariel Sharon, previously the defense minister, whom we saw during the Lebanon War, a legendary Israeli general, known for his bold and often brutal military tactics, often called a bulldozer, and a very strong advocate of Israeli settlement. Sharon is elected prime minister, and one of the things that he oversees is the construction of Israel's barrier security fence, a wall, known by Palestinians as the apartheid wall. You can see it in red on the bottom, in the bottom map. This was built as a measure of defense against, at least declared to be an important measure of security in the midst of the Second Intifada. Whether it sought to be something more than that, a kind of permanent border of sorts, it remains an open question, and we can talk about that a bit later. But in addition to this development, the creation of the security barrier, Sharon also makes another calculation. So he, at one level, is trying to sort of seal off the West Bank from Israel proper. He, in 2005, having uttered the word occupation, as did his chief aide, Ehud Olmert, in 2004, having uttered that word for the first time by an Israeli prime minister, decides to engage in a unilateral withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, which you can see in green in the bottom of the map, that little thin strip in the southwest part of the country. He is motivated by principally demographic considerations. He realizes that the Gaza Strip, with 1.5 million residents at the time, represented a security liability, and if Israel were to maintain control over it, it would have great difficulty in maintaining demographic dominance within Israel proper, which in his mind, in all likelihood, included, in some sense, the West Bank, or at least significant portions of it.
Yeah. Let me.
Sharon withdraws from Gaza in 2005 unilaterally, and that creates a vacuum.
Yeah. So I'm going to pass over Hamas's assertion of control. We'll come back to it. But it's important to understand what Israel did and did not do. What it did is it removed its settlers from Gaza. And I think one of the biggest concerns was a long-standing objection of the Israeli military was that it was very costly militarily to defend this small handful of settlers in an area of the de facto state of Israel. It was not considered centrally important to the religious and cultural traditions, the historical traditions, the same way the West Bank, parts of the West Bank were, and that it was a big burden, and they just wanted to get out of it. And Sharon, being very close to the military, I think, was reflecting that. So Israel removed its settlers and thereby removed its forces from the urban centers of Gaza. It removed itself from the interior of Gaza. But what it didn't do was remove itself from control of Gaza, because it retained control over all means of ingress and egress. The crossings, with one exception of the Rafah crossing controlled by Egypt, but all the major ones, including the only one which can handle merchandise. It retained control of the coastal waters. It retained control of the airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum. So it was a different kind of occupation. It was occupation from the outside, but not as strictly speaking, end to occupation. What also happened at this time among the Palestinian diaspora, as the Second Intifada dies down, the wall comes up, and all of this radicalization that was happening inside historical Palestine, inside Israel, inside the occupied Palestinian territories, both Israelis and Palestinians, did not translate well into the diaspora. There was not a large measure of support for Hamas or religious politics in the Palestinian diaspora and its friends, mostly in American academics and progressive movements. What ended up was the rise of the one state agenda, the idea that there should be a single democratic state for all Jews and Palestinians, including all refugees. That gained a lot of status in Palestinian diasporic rhetoric and their friends. And that was accompanied with the BDS movement, which in its activist form is an attempt to boycott Israel tout court. There are different versions among European countries that try to focus on settlements, but in the academic West and activist West, it was BDS, boycott and divest from Israel itself. It's been singularly unsuccessful.
But it came about, it seems to me, as a result of the realization that the Second Intifada had not yielded the results that it might have, or had not altered the factors on the ground, and it was presented as a non-violent form of protest, as opposed to, in stark contrast to the Second Intifada.
But it's also motivated by the anger and the radicalization. It contains within its discourse a tremendous degree of anger towards Israel. I mean, the language is quite militant, even while the tactics are strictly nonviolent.
Yeah. Anyway, the BDS movement, as many of us know, has been a presence in the United States and on college campuses since this time, developed initially in Ramallah in 2005. It sort of marks the end of the Second Intifada. It's a symbolic mark of the end of the Second Intifada. And yet, there's one final gasp that I'll let Hussein talk about.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is that during a brief period when he was prime minister, Ehud Olmert made the most serious proposals that Israel has ever made. And again, we don't have the details, and he was especially keen not to allow Mahmoud Abbas, his interlocutor, the chairman of the PLO, in this instance, more importantly than Palestinian president. And he did not give him any of the maps he showed him. He did not give him any of the written proposals. He kept it with him. There is this napkin map that Abbas had kind of drawn surreptitiously, which he wasn't supposed to do, about what was being proposed. I think you can see from the map that it was really a very far-reaching proposal. And I think Palestinians really liked what they were hearing. The negotiators, the PLO guys, really liked what they were hearing from Olmert. I think they were very tempted to embrace it, but the fear they had was that he was being opposed by his own cabinet, and particularly by his foreign secretary, Tzipi Livni, his foreign minister, who was railing against this, semi-publicly. And there was really a strong belief that he just didn't have the juice to get it through. He was under investigation for corruption, which he later did some time for. He was very ill with cancer, and he didn't have support for this, so they didn't go for it. I think several people have asked if this was the last chance for a two-state solution. I think it's a very good question. I think it was a big blunder by the PLO, because even though they were right about Olmert being out there completely on his own, Olmert says, and he said this in a conversation I had with him 2 weeks ago for Northwestern University, why that's true, but why didn't they call my bluff? Why didn't they accept it and create conditions whereby I could rally public opinion and get my people on board? Like, by saying no to me, they fixed the opposition that I was surrounded by in place, and they didn't play their cards right. I strongly agree with that. It's tragic.
Though Olmert did not have the political capital that would have been needed to persuade the Israeli public, he was in a deeply compromised position. As you noted, his own cabinet was resistant to what was on the table. And it's ironic that Tzipi Livni has become one of the chief advocates of the two-state solution after this. She's
to his left now, because I've had a conversation with her in the past few months online, and she's to his left.
Yeah. So Olmert exits the scene. The napkin map is consigned to the dustbin of history until it's released as part of the leak of the Palestine papers, and the Palestinian movement fractures. Do you want to say a word about this?
Yeah, let me go through this really quickly.
Okay.
Yasser Arafat was placed under siege for more than a year in his compound in Ramallah, which became increasingly squalid. And he was an old man, not very well, and under those extremely unhygienic conditions, unsurprisingly died. The conspiracy theories are mightily unimpressive. Old man dies, it's not, a big mystery, under squalid conditions. So that was in 2004. As a result, Palestinians had lost their uncontested leader and the founder of their modern national movement. So there was a presidential election in 2005, and his successor, Mahmoud Abbas, won the presidency with 63% of the vote. Next year, there was a parliamentary election in which Hamas-backed candidates, not necessarily Hamas candidates, but Hamas-backed candidates, won 43% in the parliamentary elections and therefore dominated the parliament. So you had a year of very uneasy Palestinian cohabitation with a very empowered presidency run by Fatah under Abbas, and an ambitious and upstart legislature dominated by Hamas-backed candidates in pretty strong opposition. It all broke down in 2007 when Hamas lost its temper and violently expelled Fatah from Gaza, including throwing Fatah cadres off of rooftops. And Fatah responded by expelling Hamas figures from the West Bank. And the divide set in place. There have been no elections on either side since. And Fatah has ruled Area A in the West Bank. And Hamas has controlled Area A in Gaza until the recent Israeli attack, which has left the place very unruled. But anyway, this division has not been resolved, and it has crippled the Palestinian national movement.
Right. I just want to take stock of where we've been. We've talked about pairs of leaders, Rabin and Arafat, Olmert and Abbas. We now have Hamas as a key player in shaping Palestinian politics. And this is the prelude to the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu, or actually, more accurately, the return to power of Benjamin Netanyahu, because he served as prime minister between 1996 and 1999, re-elected in 2009, and he has essentially served, with the exception of 1 year, as prime minister since that time. This is the Netanyahu era, or the long Netanyahu decade. He comes into office in 2009 wiser than he had been before, and with a clear agenda of what he wants to do, which is really to effect a transformation of Israel into a different kind of state than he believed it had been previously. Not one for which peace with one's neighbors, particularly Palestinians, was the most important principle, but rather one in which the Jewish people would have absolute rights to self-determination and a complete veil of security surrounding it. Along with that, Netanyahu was interested in kind of recalibrating the balance between the Jewishness and the democratic nature of the state. Earlier in the early 1990s, there were efforts to define Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And for many of the exponents of that formula, there was a strong impulse to introduce liberal democratic values and make them constitutive of the Israeli constitutional order in the absence of an actual written constitution, to do that by enshrining such principles in basic laws of the Knesset. Netanyahu had a very different vision. To the extent that he has a democratic vision, it really follows in the line of his ally and friend, who also re-entered political office around this time, Viktor Orban, re-elected as Prime Minister of Hungary in 2010, for whom the operative strategy is what he calls illiberal democracy, which is a form of majoritarianism, which says if you have 50% plus one, you can basically decide what you want to do without regard to minorities in your midst or even the rights of individuals. And Netanyahu really begins to reshape the Israeli polity in that image of an illiberal democratic order, introducing laws directed against progressive NGOs, against the right of Muslims to have their call to prayer heard, a whole range of actions that sort of reflect this right-wing ethno-nationalist agenda.
The status of Arabic.
The status of Arabic, and that is enshrined in its most complete form in the basic law, which has quasi-constitutional power devoted to the subject of the nation state, enacted by the Knesset in July 2018. It establishes the land of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. And if we move down to C, it asserts that it is the Jews and the Jews alone who have the right to exercise self-determination in that state. It also reorders the status of Arabic, as Hussein mentioned, and is significant really in drawing away from that early era of Israeli politics, which was quite obsessed with the prospect of achieving a peaceable arrangement with the Palestinians. This is more a strategy of Israel disengaging from the Palestinian question, asserting its rights to sovereignty and absolute sovereignty in the land, which had expansive contours for Netanyahu, insofar as he regarded the West Bank as and regards it as wholly part of the state of Israel, yet at some level opens up a new window of opportunity that others seized upon. Hussein.
Yeah, thank you very much. What you ended up with is a situation of increasing stridency and increasing sort of maximum claims coming out of Netanyahu and his allies. But you also had a series of very close elections, in which Israel was unable to create a stable government. Netanyahu kept surviving, but always by the skin of his teeth. The Trump administration issued a proposal in February of 2020, either late January or early February, called From Peace to Prosperity, this so-called Kushner Plan, which, among other things, envisaged Israel as annexing at least 30% more of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, which would have completely surrounded any potential Palestinian state within this greater Israel. It wouldn't have had any access to the outside world except through Israel. It would have made a two-state solution frankly impossible. Netanyahu seized upon that and ran on it and got reelected in the early summer on the pledge of immediately starting the annexation envisaged in the Trump-Kushner proposal. Trump, though, was horrified and let it be known to the Israelis that he considered annexation a second-term issue and that he was completely full up with COVID, that he'd done enough for Israel by recognizing Israel's sovereignty in Jerusalem, but not clarifying what exactly he was talking about, west, east, what. But, I mean, he moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he'd recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, and he'd done a great deal for the Israelis, including this plan that really sort of creates space for Americans, especially on the right, that don't want a two-state solution or want to join the Israeli right in denouncing it, to get the political bandwidth to do that. He created space, stretched the Overton window in Washington on annexation and created space to be anti-two-state. But Netanyahu, also having pledged to annex, I think realized that it was a very dumb idea. It's a very provocative thing to do, and it's a matter of changing signs. Since Israel already controls these territories, what difference does it make? And it's a very risky thing to do. It runs counter to his cautious, risk-averse personality. And he's being pushed by Trump. So both of them are looking for ways to get out of this trap. In comes the UAE with Yusuf al-Otaiba, the ambassador to Washington, and Anwar Gargash, the foreign policy guru in Abu Dhabi, coming up with this plan, proposing normalization with Israel by the UAE in exchange for Israel agreeing not to conduct any annexations for at least 5 years. In other words, through the potential Trump second term. That's very significant. That's what it was. And quickly, Bahrain followed suit and jumped on board. Then they called it the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration claimed credit for it. Israel was happy to accept this deal. And eventually, Morocco joined in exchange for U.S. recognition of Morocco's annexation of the Western Sahara. And Sudan joined in exchange for getting taken off the terrorism list and getting a shot of much needed economic support from Gulf countries. All of these were separate deals with Washington. Each country that joined the Abraham Accords process has had a separate ask of the United States or a separate agenda regarding Israel. So Bahrain and the UAE have very different expectations of what they were going to get out of the Israelis and the Americans. One thing that's constant, though, is that in no case was the Palestinian question advanced unless you were to credit the UAE's argument that it was doing the Palestinians a big favor and the world a big favor by saving the two-state solution and the prospect of a Palestinian state from annexation. That's certainly an interesting claim. It's plausible, but the UAE had been looking for an opportunity to normalize with Israel for at least 2 years, and it took it. So this is essentially what happened with the Abraham Accords.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left in the whole session, and there are 27 questions. I'm just going to run through very briefly the final slide, and we'll make our way to the point at which we'll pick up in the fourth presentation. And Hussein already hinted at this, the tremendous instability that went along with the extraordinary stability. That is to say, this is the stability of Netanyahu's reign from 2009 essentially to the present, but tremendous parliamentary instability as is really characteristic of the Knesset, where small parties can dictate the course of affairs in order to wedge or leverage their larger coalition partners to do things they want. And when that doesn't happen, you can have a call for new elections very quickly. 5 Knesset elections between 2019 to 2022. In one of those elections, an alternative to the Likud-led coalition was elected, a coalition whose leaders were Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, which lasted a year, was seen at the time as the possible change government insofar as it actually represented a change from Netanyahu-led Likud. After that, government collapsed. There was another call for election. The election took place on November 1st, 2022. In that election, Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to return to the seat of prime minister, was compelled to forge a coalition with far-right extremist political actors, most significantly the current Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who pushed Netanyahu even further toward a kind of anti-Arab racist agenda, and in addition, sought to really reorder the rules of Israeli politics by stripping away authority from the judiciary in what they called a judicial overhaul. Others have called a judicial coup. I'll just mention that the response to the proposals that you see here listed on this slide, the response by the Israeli public was huge and spontaneous. Already in January 2023, mass protests began in many cities and towns throughout Israel, hundreds of thousands of people every week. The protest movement lasted for 10 months, up until the event of October 7th, 2023. And I think that we should probably
but let me just throw out one thing. In the Bennett-Lapid coalition, this is significant. There was for the first time a Palestinian member of the cabinet, Mansour Abbas, who is an Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood guy, but from the more conciliatory branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Israel. And he was actually part of that government. And it's a breakthrough, very controversial among Palestinian citizens of Israel, with lots of people supporting this and seeing it as the way forward, and lots of people criticizing it, not yet being ready to join with parties that are avowedly Zionist and what have you. So it, again, for Palestinian narratives, it's another inflection point. And it's remarkable that an Islamist and a very conservative Islamist was the guy to do it.
Right. We will, of course, address in full October 7th when we meet again on March 19th.
Yep,
I'm going to stop.
in person.
Thank you so much for this very, very, very rich talk again, filled with there, as you could see, the question and answer section is just hopping. We don't have too much time, so I want to group a couple of questions around certain topics. So one of the questions deals with the UN and the role of UN, and why did the Palestinian question essentially move out of the UN and into the hands of the US when there were already various resolutions concerning the this region. And yeah.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Israel and Israelis do not trust the UN in any of its entities, including the Security Council, which is subject to US veto. But Palestinians have seen the UN as a vehicle for trying to move forward. And in the absence of any negotiations with Israel, Abbas went to the UN Security Council and asked for membership in the UN and was turned down flat. And then he went to the next year, he went to the General Assembly, and he was able to upgrade the PLO's mission status to non-member observer state status. And every state that has been a non-member observer state of the UN has subsequently become a member state, either on its own or as part of a united Vietnam or united Germany or what have you, except for the Vatican, the Holy See, which does not aspire to membership. It's happy to be a non-member observer state. So this is really valuable to the Palestinians, but the blow to the PA was enormous as Israel and the US cut off funding and destroyed the career of Salam Fayyad, the best leader Palestinians had ever had.
Yeah, I'll just add to that 2 points. One, the era that we've just been talking about is the era of American unipolarity.
Right.
The United States is basically the chief political actor on the international stage, and it has a vested interest in certainly Israel and at least rhetorically in the resolution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and more than rhetorically, I would say. So we have to recognize where the power lies. And that, I think, points up the fact that the United Nations is at best a coalition of diverse actors, but not a prime mover in significant political or diplomatic breakthroughs. And that may be lamentable, but that's the reality.
Yeah.
The second question is about the negotiations for a two-state solution, the failure of those negotiations. We've all many of us have seen either various documentaries or films or any kind of thing, how talking about, and you mentioned that too, the sort of the idea of the generosity of Israel's offers to the Palestinians and the rejection on the part of Palestinians. But then in your talk, it wasn't clear what the offers actually were and whether there were any concrete ever offers to recognize the state of Israel. You mentioned that Rabin didn't really support or voice support for Palestinian statehood. So could you just sort of sum up the question of the recognition of the Palestinian state on the Israeli side?
I can. It was not part of anything Rabin was party to, although it seems to be implicit in the Oslo agreements. It's not anywhere explicit, and he was very careful not to make it explicit. Whether he would have moved there or not, we don't know. Barak was proposing a Palestinian state, but it was a Palestinian state that was non-contiguous, among other things. That's one thing we get from most observers. Now, as I say, we don't have any hard documents, so we have to rely on testimonies, which are at very least the 7 men in the elephant, you know, where different people are feeling different parts of it, and you're not getting a really good sense of the whole. The one place where Israel, I think, was determined to actually, where an Israeli leader was determined to go there to a Palestinian state, you could say Taba was definitely predicated on Palestinian statehood. Olmert was certainly looking to create a Palestinian state alongside Israel, no question about it, which is why Palestinians liked what they were hearing from him, but they really didn't have the juice to get it through. So we are in this place where Israel has never recognized formally not only a Palestinian state, but the Palestinian right to statehood. And a lot of the Arab states and the United States and European states are saying that at the end of the day, when the Gaza war ends, there's whatever happens, there's got to be a commitment by Israel to accept the need to create a Palestinian state eventually. And then we can negotiate what it looks like. But, you know, that is a kind of a sine qua non. And unfortunately, the Israeli cabinet just issued a resolution saying absolutely not under no circumstances.
Yeah, I have a somewhat different view. I think there certainly were trusted diplomats serving in the Israeli Foreign Service who were agitating toward recognition of the Palestinian state, and
Sure
indeed making that case quite clearly, especially in places like Taba, which
Yeah.
are what were represented the latest stage of the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, again, December 2000, January 2001. There is a kind of unresolved question about whether Rabin himself had ever committed, orally or in written form, to recognition of a Palestinian state. And there's been a kind of unacknowledged or unverifiable myth that his chief aide, Eitan Haber, had in his possession a note in which Rabin formulated his own commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state. But that remains
We don't have it.
unverified, and alas, went to Haber's grave with him. So we don't know.
But we don't disagree. I don't disagree with a word of that.
So we were talking about essentially the asymmetry with the PLO recognizing Israel's existence and Israel not recognizing that. But then we also talked about the shift to a one-state rhetoric, which effectively seems to be erasing that recognition of Israel as a state in the region. So I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about it, and also talking about the language that's used. And in that context, you were talking about the apartheid wall versus a security wall. Obviously, different sides have this. But does the rhetoric of apartheid emerge from the process of erasure of the recognition of the state, or how does it apply to this context in the that we're talking about for this period?
Two things, and then I'll let David chime in. The first is that, look, you've got to understand that the PLO speaks for the Palestinians on the world stage. Nobody disputes that, not even Hamas. It is to dispute that is to put at risk the Palestinian presence in the world, the non-member state status that I talked about, and the 130 embassies and missions around the world, which is one of the few things the Palestinians have acquired during the past half century of struggle that Israel can't possibly take away from them. And it's very valuable, and whoever controls it leads the movement. So this is really essential. The PLO has never spoken in terms of a one-state solution. So activists in Palestine, but especially outside, have done that. But they are, none of that speaks to the PLO's recognition of Israel. There is no contradiction here because, rhetoric by activists is one thing, and the solemn obligations and proclamations of the diplomatic representative of a people is another. The second thing is a question of rhetoric. I think the rhetoric has been very damaging, and I think that hyperbole is rampant on both sides, and it's extremely damaging. As for apartheid, I think it's a term that's intellectually valid and absolutely correct in all respects to describe the occupied territories, especially the West Bank. But I fear that it gets us, when you use it, it gets us into an argument about the validity of an analogy and what was South Africa like and all of these side issues, and we stop talking about realities on the ground in the occupied territories, which I want to focus on. So I don't really like it for that reason.
Yeah, I'll just say two quick things. One, the one-state idea. So the one-state idea, as embodied in the opening declaration of the BDS movement in 2005, came, I think, as a result of the realization on the part of Palestinian intellectuals that the two-state era had come to an end with the Second Intifada. So there's a realization that that path had been closed off, and many Palestinian intellectuals weren't that upset to see it closed off. Though it should be noted that throughout the Oslo era, the percentage of support for a two-state solution was very closely correlated on both Palestinian and Israeli sides. They were very much tied together. They rose together and they declined together, pretty much in sync. But what I think is important to note is that the one state idea is not only advocated by Palestinians, it's also advocated by a growing number of Israelis who realize, or in fact celebrate, the fact that the Green Line has been erased for all intents and purposes by the settler movement, and that Israel, from, shall we say, the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, represents a single polity under Israeli control. There's some who regard that as essential and as a political good. Others regard it as a necessity, and others lament it. But many came to see that as indeed a goal to be achieved, and saw it within their grasp. So I'll just say a final word about apartheid. The term appears in the context of Israel as early as the 1975 UN resolution on declaring Zionism as racism. So its roots extend back to there, but of course, the term picks up considerable momentum in the post-Oslo period.
And
can I just say, well, Magda, let me just say that, look,
I'm going to have to jump off in a minute for another.
Okay, all right, no, let's go ahead then.
So I have a final question, but perhaps it's one that you will elaborate on next time. That is, again, a question of language, but the difference between what we've been seeing in the streets, but also in the questions, the difference between resistance versus terrorism.
Yeah.
So maybe we can chime in a little bit on that, and then we'll wrap it to meet next month.
So listen, for Israelis, all Palestinian active resistance is terrorism. Stone throwing, or even picking up a stone, is terrorism. Even protesting can be terrorism. It's terrorism becomes a quality that is simply associated with Palestinians and characterizes their fundamental ontological nature, right? That's, I think, what we end up with in Israeli narratives. For Palestinians, though, everything gets put in the category of resistance, including a killing spree and a set of really brutal massacres in southern Israel, on October 7th. All of it is resistance. And the people who fall in the who get shot during nonviolent protests are martyrs, and people who are in the efforts, who are killed in suicide bombings or in other efforts to murder Israeli civilians, are also called martyrs. So there's a kind of a conflation on both sides of everyone good or everyone bad. And then, of course, the other side is equally all good or all bad. And I think it's very, very damaging, because in fact, what we have here is human beings behaving like human beings in a structured relationship of dominance and subordination that can't play out much differently unless you change the basic context of the relationship, unless you change the political structures.
I have to, alas, run, but I will only say that this is a question we can take up again, but these are terms that lie in the eyes of the beholder, and we can elaborate on that further on March 19th.
Right.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us, and we'll continue on March 19th in person and on Zoom. Thank you for so many of you joining us, sticking through the whole long conversation. Thank you, Hussein, and thank you, David, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.